Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. This is Showing Up for Trans Lives with Chase Strangio. We are so excited to have you here. My name is Tegan Rabuano. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director of the NYU LGBTQ+ Center. I also want to flag that this event will be recorded and uploaded to the NYU Office of Global Inclusion YouTube page after we wrap up. And live captioning is available for this event using the CC button below. So for those who don't know, the LGBTQ+ Center at NYU's goal is to create a welcoming environment for students, faculty, staff, and alums to engage with and develop their understanding of LGBTQ+ communities. This session today is a part of NYU Trans Awareness Week. Trans Awareness Week at NYU is a week-long series of events that celebrates the lives and experiences of transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive people and educates the NYU community about how to better support these communities. So before we get into our main program for today, I want to invite some guests that we have from NYU Outlaw who have co-sponsored this event with us. They're going to share a little bit about what they do, and I will invite them to turn their camera on and chat a little bit right now.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the NYU LGBTQ Center for organizing this event. We're very excited to hear from Chase about supporting trans and non-binary community members amid the current extreme surge of anti-trans legislation nationwide. My name's Kieran, and I use he, him pronouns, and I am chair of Outlaw and president of IDP, which is the Identity Documents Project here at the law school, and I am proud to be trans.
Hi, my name is Isaiah. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the TGNCI Plus Chair of Outlaw and Operations Chair of the Identity Documents Project. I'm very excited to join this discussion as a trans law student. So Outlaw is NYU Law's affinity group for queer and trans law students, as well as their friends. Outlaw sponsors social events, panels, and political actions that bring members of our community together and provide support for queer and trans students and alumni of the law school. One of our projects that we're hoping to establish this year is a mentorship program for transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary law students, connecting them with practicing attorneys that share their identities. So if you are a trans attorney who's interested in mentoring a trans law student, please let us know and we will be in touch.
The Identity Documents Project at NYU is a nonprofit and student organization that assists trans and gender nonconforming New Yorkers to obtain court-ordered name changes and update identity documents to display their names and gender markers. We train our advocates to help our clients with these update processes and to raise funds to assist with document update fees. If you are interested in collaborating with Outlaw or IDP, or if you would like assistance updating your name and gender marker on your identity documents, please reach out to the LGBTQ Center and they will connect us.
We aim to support and stand up for queer and trans people within our community. As our trans siblings nationwide face legislative attacks, trans students within our own community face harassment, misgendering, and threats of violence. During this week of trans awareness, we encourage you to show up for trans lives by speaking out against this violence and to resist silence and stand in solidarity with all queer and trans people.
We hope that you'll keep in mind the powerful words from Marsha P. Johnson, "No pride for some without liberation for all of us." Take to heart the idea that queer and trans liberation goes hand in hand with liberation from oppression in all of its forms, including anti-Blackness, xenophobia, and colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And another huge thank you to NYU Outlaw for their support and partnership in this program. And now I am so excited to introduce Chase Strangio. Chase is Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV Project. A national leader in transgender rights litigation and advocacy, Chase has been counsel in some of the past decade's most pivotal legal fights on behalf of transgender litigants. In addition to his advocacy in the courtroom and in state legislatures, Chase appears regularly in media and has produced multiple short films, including the Emmy Award-winning short, Texas Strong. In 2020, Chase was named to Time Magazine's list of the most 100 influential people of the year. I'm so excited now to welcome Chase for our conversation today. Hi, Chase. How are you?
I'm good, Tegan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we're thrilled to have you as a part of NYU Trans Awareness Week. And for this session today, we're going to be talking a little bit about how folks both within trans and non-binary communities and our allies outside of those communities can show up for trans lives together as we, embark on what's probably going to be a pretty difficult year after a string of difficult years for trans and non-binary communities. So I've got some questions for you. And before I get into my questions for our attendees, anyone who has questions for Chase, there will be an opportunity toward the end of the session for attendee Q&A. So as we are going through this conversation, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please put your questions in there throughout, and we will pull from those, and then we'll ask those during the Q&A portion. So, Chase, to start things off, I'm wondering, it's been such a barrage of anti-trans legislation this year, particularly during the early part of this year. And I think that due to how much was happening all across the country, it's been really difficult to keep track of what's actually going on. So I'm wondering if maybe you can provide an overview of the recent surge in anti-trans legislation in the US and its impact on trans and non-binary communities.
Yeah, no, it obviously has been a really troubling few years with a very clear escalation in 2023. So if we think about this contemporary set of legislative attacks on trans people, most of which are happening at the state level, it really begins in 2016 after the Supreme Court decided the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, which had struck down remaining bans on marriage equality. And so a lot of the resources and momentum from the political right that had been mobilized to stop marriage equality was very quickly shifted to attacking trans people. And it started at the beginning of the 2016 legislative session. That's where we saw the first mass introduction of anti-trans bathroom bills. And at that time, North Carolina passed what was called HB2, their state bathroom ban. That was the only anti-trans bill that passed that year, explicitly anti-trans, I should say. And although there was one other in Mississippi, but the only bathroom ban that passed, and it was ultimately partially repealed, then enjoined in court. And there was a period of time where it was politically toxic. It was seen as politically toxic to try to move anti-trans bills. And some of the state attacks waned during the Trump administration because state lawmakers had thought that since they had an ally at the federal government, there was less pressure on the states to move this anti-trans legislation. So what we see now is the post-2020 backlash to both the election of President Biden as well as to the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, holding that federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination protect LGBTQ people in the context of workplace discrimination. And so you have in June of 2020, the Supreme Court ruling in Bostock in favor of the LGBTQ workers, and you have Biden getting elected. And from 21 to the present is really when we see these bills flooding state legislatures. And the first round was very focused on banning trans women and girls from women and girls sports. And that obviously has escalated very rapidly to extend to bans on access to gender affirming healthcare for transgender adolescents, as well as bans on transgender students using restrooms, moving into and criminal bans on trans adults using public restrooms, and all of the other types of restrictions like curricular bans, forced outing bills in which states pass requirements that school staff notify parents if a student is exploring their gender identity or sexual orientation. So lots of far-reaching implications moving very rapidly. So we went from a situation in 2020 where there's one state that bans trans women and girls from sports, Idaho. And by 2023, we have a situation where 21 states ban gender affirming care for trans adolescents. 18 of those bans were passed in 2023 alone. So that's just this year. So thinking about this scale of this assault and the rapid rate at which these bills moved through legislatures, became law, and and care was shut down in large swaths of the country. That is what we're dealing with today. And on the sports, in sports, it's also over 20 states banning trans women and girls from sports, some states passing multiple laws banning trans girls from sports, and then an increasing number of states also banning trans youth from using the restroom at school.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, in that vein, you've touched on, I think, some of these key pieces of legislation that have come up, but I'm wondering, are there other key bills and policies that have been either proposed or enacted at either the state or federal level that are directly affecting trans and non-binary individuals and their rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think something to keep an eye on are new bills that either restrict the ability of secondary and secondary school teachers to talk about LGBTQ issues in class. So this would be Florida's version of what they call the Don't Say Gay bill. So we're seeing more and more of those, as well as bills around pronoun use, allowing school staff to misgender students, and in some cases prohibiting teachers and other school staff from announcing their pronouns if it's inconsistent with their quote unquote biological pronouns, which I think we can all agree is not a real thing. And then I think the other thing that we haven't really seen enacted, but I would say is sort of the next frontier of the trend, would be more and more attacks on adults. And so this will come, I think, in the form, first and foremost, of attacks on access to gender-affirming healthcare. It will look a lot like the anti-abortion playbook, starting with the youth, and then focusing on public funding for care. So that would be sort of efforts to restrict Medicaid coverage and coverage of gender-affirming healthcare for state employees or through other government programs. This all at the state level is what I would anticipate in the next legislative session. And then also what we saw in Arkansas and a version passed in Florida are these bills that attempt to criminalize trans people using the restrooms. And these are really a throwback in many ways to criminal cross-dressing laws, the idea that people can surveil your body, decide whether you're supposed to be there, and then that can become a part of the way in which trans people are criminalized. And we know that's not the only way, but this is a new way where explicitly anti-trans lawmaking is attacking our communities, limiting people's ability to move in public space. And then, this is all happening at the state level. I think what's important to recognize is all of these efforts are also moving at the federal level. They're moving through bills that are introduced in the House where they have a more favorable reception. They get markups. So we have bills that would federally ban gender-affirming care for minors, bills that would impose other far-reaching penalties on the provision of gender-affirming care for minors, including, for example, immigration consequences for doctors who provide gender-affirming care. So thinking about all of the ways in which the federal government might continue to weaponize this care, and then other bills at the federal level around sports. None of those bills are going to move in the current Congress and with the current president. So that is, they're moving them in the House. They're, they've been introduced. Some of them have had hearings. We expect they will, continue to advance in the House. This then raises, I'm sure we'll talk about sort of what happens in a post-2024 world, and after January of 2025, when you have the inauguration of the next president and a potential flip in the makeup of the Senate, then all of the things we're seeing at the state level potentially become conversations about what's happening at the federal level.
Yeah, and you highlighted this, right, that, some of these bills are things that are returning either from something that that happened in recent years or something that was a law long ago. So I'm wondering how these anti-trans legislative efforts that we're seeing right now compare to past trends in LGBTQ plus rights and acceptance in the US, and if there's anything that we can gain from, looking at the trajectory of those past trends as we now kind of, embark on these next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most immediate comparator, especially as we're looking to the 2024 presidential election, is the early 2000s. At that time, you had the GOP in particular putting anti-gay marriage initiatives on the ballot to drive out voters in the 2004 presidential election, in the 2006 midterm elections, and even in the 2002 elections. So that was one thing that we saw, was that you went from, there was almost no progress on marriage equality. There was some progress, and the backlash was astounding. You had most of the country constitutionally banning marriage equality for same-sex couples, and that was also happening in progressive places. I think that's also really important to keep in mind, that something that we've come to accept as relatively commonplace in the United States, and something that is, many people think that they've always supported, even if they haven't. In New York, the New York High Court upheld the restriction on marriage for same-sex couples. It was a progressive court, Maryland, Washington. So that was the reality in the early 2000s. And obviously there was a substantial change over a short period of time that was instructive in the sense that it was a product not of changed legal advocacy strategies, but of changed cultural strategies, change around the discourse around particularly gay people. Now, there was also a conservative sort of assimilationist narrative that drove marriage equality, which is why I think it was so successful in a short period of time. It sort of was about inclusion in a conservative institution that highlighted very particular white cis individuals, sort of making a "we're just like you" argument. And at the same time, it was, there was only losing for a long time. And it was losing in a way that very, very much effectively drove voters out in favor of GOP candidates in election years. So that was very similar to what I think we can imagine in 2024, and certainly what's been happening over the last few years, in which anti-trans rhetoric and discourse, definitely at the state level, has been a tool of mobilizing. People are attempting to gain their far right-wing credentials by being anti-trans. Now, so that's sort of a recent analog. I do think it's important to note that it does sort of anti-trans rhetoric does play well in state legislative fights. It doesn't when you look at the outcomes of federal elections, however. So for example, in November of 2022, the Republican Party spent a significant amount of money putting anti-trans rhetoric into Michigan elections. And this was a place where they thought was a key battleground, and it's just a colossal failure. Michigan, went to the Democratic Party, at the governor level in both chambers of the legislature, so total transformation. So, all of their efforts to put anti-trans rhetoric into that fight as an electoral matter were very unsuccessful. And we've seen that, alongside all of the ways in which abortion has motivated voters on the left, that it has not been politically effective for the right to be either anti-abortion or anti-trans in these electoral contexts. But they continue to do it because it polls well to attack trans people.
Awesome. Thank you. I have to say, just really briefly, before we get into more questions, this is such a masterclass right now. I feel like this information is so crucial and so helpful, because it can be really difficult, I think, to, know where to even start looking when it comes to, trying to track what's going on or even anticipate where we might be going. So yeah, obviously 2024 is an election year, and I think that that's causing a lot of anxiety within LGBTQ plus communities. I know certainly I'm feeling a lot of anxiety going into next year. And not only is 2024 an election year, but the Supreme Court has been, hearing more and more cases that are, really instrumental in this fight. And we're anticipating that there may be a case regarding the trans community that the Supreme Court hears next year. And obviously the outcome of that could have catastrophic effects. So, how can we prepare for what may be the most difficult and challenging year so far ahead? How can we maybe brace ourselves? And, if you can share more about what we can expect from 2024.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's very anxiety inducing to think about an upcoming presidential election in this climate, after all of that we're seeing in the state legislative fights, on top of the judicial fights that are likely to happen at the Supreme Court. And sort of just to make one comparison, going back to the last question about sort of where are our analogs in history. This attacking trans people isn't new, and we've seen different iterations of that. And obviously our communities have fought and resisted for generations, for decades, for centuries, and we've always been here doing that. So I think when we think about all of the things we're up against, it's also important to remember that the attacks aren't new, and our fortitude and resilience has very much always been there. And so we have the tools within our communities to figure out how to fight back. So that's how I approach all of this in terms of specifically what we can expect. And, we're just, 6 weeks away from 2024, which is terrifying in and of itself. And so first and foremost, we have to be prepared for the fact that the state legislatures are going to reconvene and we're going to see new attacks on us. And so all of the things I highlighted that we have to be worried about in the future are very much coming soon. We can't just say, oh, we'll deal with that at a later time. The time is now. Lawmakers are already planning to introduce anti-trans bills in state legislatures. The right wing within state legislatures is already sort of positioning themselves to fend off primaries from the right. So we have to sort of look at this at various different levels, starting with what's going to happen in just a few weeks in state legislatures across the country. 21 states have banned gender affirming care. They're going to move on to something else. And that's, we have to be prepared for that. Then, of course, that's layered on top of the election fight. And so I think despite the fact that it hasn't been successful in the electoral sense to be an anti-trans candidate, if you think about 2016, for example, the time when the Democrats lost everything, quite literally, the one thing they didn't lose was the governor's race in North Carolina, because Governor McCrory, who had been the Republican governor of North Carolina, had pushed and supported HB2, the anti-trans bill, and he was ousted by Governor Cooper. So that was the one example in 2016 of a Democrat winning, and it was because the Republican was so toxic in its anti-trans policymaking. That is a lesson that the Democratic Party and the public discourse didn't heed. I think we often hear, oh, Hillary lost because she supported pronouns. Like, first of all, that doesn't even make any sense. Second of all, Hillary didn't support trans people very robustly. And third of all, it wasn't a losing issue. And every outcome show that. And I think that, the most recent last week's elections also were a rebuke of that idea. You have in Kentucky, for example, Governor Beshear winning the election. He had vetoed all of the anti-trans bills against his opponent, the Attorney General Cameron, who was defending all those bills in court. So if you look just strictly at the gubernatorial race in Kentucky, it's another example of that idea that supporting trans people as a politician is bad for your reelection or is bad politics. It just isn't true. Now, on the Republican Party side, I think we can expect to see a lot of anti-trans rhetoric and fear-mongering coming out of the candidates as the primaries get closer and closer. So that's the sort of discursive thing that's going to be an atmosphere that we have to be mindful of. And then when we think about the ultimate outcome of the November 2024 elections, they're just so critical for trans survival, because at the end of the day, and for so many communities, if we do end up in a situation where we have former President Trump or some other candidate like him in the presidency, and the likely outcome of the congressional races is that you have Republicans having control of the Senate and the House, then, like I said, every single thing we see at the state level becomes federal policy, because we'll not be in a position to stop them federally. And we can talk about what's going on in the courts, but it's going to be increasingly difficult to then also challenge all these things in court. And that is just a reality we have to contend with. There's lots of reasons from my perspective to be highly critical of this administration, to be highly critical of the Democratic Party when it comes to trans people, highly critical of the policy outcomes that we've seen. I also believe that the consequences of having anti-trans politicians leading in the Senate and leading in the executive are just going to be so catastrophic for our communities that we won't come back for that for generations. And that includes, the transformation of the judicial system even further. One of the ways that Donald Trump was an incredibly effective president was the way in which he transformed the federal courts, and the number of Donald Trump appointees on the federal courts, not just the Supreme Court, in which he had 3, but also all of the lower federal courts, the circuit courts of appeal, the district courts, totally have transformed how we're able to hold those legislative incursions into our rights, into our autonomy in check. We're supposed to have 3 branches of government. We're supposed to have a check on executive and legislative power through the courts, but we know that that's very limited and not happening in all the ways that we need. And so when it comes to what's happening for trans people in the federal courts in particular, it's a grim picture, I'll say. We had some early successes blocking these laws in court, but as we've gone up in the courts, as these wins in the lower courts have gone up in appeal, we've been losing them. And the losses are so devastating because what that means is all of these bans on healthcare are going into effect. And there's large regions of the country, the South and the Midwest in particular, where care is mostly not available for trans adolescents. And that's an untenable situation. So we've asked in the Supreme Court to review our case, which was a loss in one of the appellate courts after we had won in Tennessee and Kentucky. Both of the cases have now gone up and asked the Supreme Court to take the case. Obviously, hugely risky thing to do because it's not like this Supreme Court is known for its defense of civil rights and bodily autonomy. However, it's also not a tenable thing to just stack up a bunch of losses and have a landscape where you end up just having care erosion so significantly across the country, which is the alternative. And so we're in a situation now where we're trying to overturn those bad decisions. We'll see what the Supreme Court does. If they do take those healthcare cases, they won't be argued until the fall of 2024. It means they won't be decided until June of 2025, most likely. There is also a case at the Supreme Court now at the cert stage, so the court hasn't accepted it, but there was out of Indiana, trans student barred from the restroom, sued his school. That was a successful case. The appellate court affirmed the lower court, so the school district has now asked the Supreme Court to reverse. So the possibility as well that the Supreme Court will take the question of, does it violate the Constitution of the United States and federal civil rights laws to exclude trans students from restrooms, could also be up before the court. And there's reason to be obviously very nervous about all of this. And then of course, you have the landscape, the political landscape, the cultural landscape. And the other thing to think about as we're looking at these legislative attacks and at these judicial losses is that they're all being fueled by a cultural climate that legitimizes debate over trans life. And this is something that's happening not just in the far right media, but in the center left media, in places like the New York Times that regularly attack and question our healthcare and don't defer to the expertise of doctors, frame up a debate that in no way resembles the way in which this care has long been provided.
I mean, before we move into the next question, thank you for these, like I said, truly, like, this is such a masterclass, and hearing this right now, I think is so crucial as we prepare. I think that being armed with knowledge and like having an idea about what we can do to look ahead to 2024 is going to be so helpful. I also want to just flag for our attendees, if you have questions that you want to ask for Chase, we'll start taking those questions in like roughly 10 minutes. So please put those into the Q&A function below on Zoom. We are going to be really excited to take those questions in just a few minutes here. But yeah, so we talked about the 2024 election. We talked about the landscape of what's going on with trans and non-binary rights within the United States right now, but we're not just seeing an increase in attacks on these communities within the US, right? So I'm wondering, Chase, if you can share beyond the United States on a global scale. Are you aware of any similar trends or developments in other countries regarding anti-trans legislation? And do those compare to what we're seeing domestically, or are those trends looking a little different?
No, I mean, I think it's really important to recognize this as a global movement attacking trans people, and not just attacking trans people, but sort of attempting to reinforce and control the gender binary, to control the heterosexual nuclear family. And the reason why we're seeing this as a global movement is that we're also seeing the rise of far-right governments around the world, and attacks on trans bodies, attacks on bodily autonomy go hand in hand with the rise of fascism. So you could look to Bolsonaro's government in Brazil, for example, obviously no longer in power, but as Bolsonaro rose to power, you saw that sort of fixation with attacking quote unquote gender ideology. You see this in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, in the UK and in Scandinavian countries, where there are increasing political attacks and efforts to control trans bodies, to reinforce and reinscribe the sex binary as part of a rise in right-wing governments. It goes hand in hand, and it makes sense. If you're trying to understand the way in which anti-democratic forces rise to power, they do so by controlling individuals in the sites of the family, the sites of the body. If you are, the more autonomy you have, the more resistance you're able to have to a government that is going to control every aspect of your life. And so these are global movements. A lot of the organizations and a lot of the money is in the United States. And so we have to be mindful of the way in which we're exporting the financial resources for these movements that are, are able to take hold around the world. And then some of the cultural products and that we have that are being imported to the United States are coming from the UK. The anti-trans, so-called radical feminist discourse that has long been here. We had Janice Raymond, who was instrumental in codifying anti-trans and trans misogynistic discourse in US law, decades ago. It's not that this is new, but if we think about its contemporary moment, you can look to the UK and you can see the cultural rhetoric coming from the UK being imported back to the United States, but it is our money that's fueling it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, certainly it's not new. We actually, we spoke a little bit about Janice Raymond at an event earlier in the spring. We had Sandy Stone at NYU. So yeah, it's helpful to think about it in that context as well, looking back and seeing how, so many of these talking points just aren't new. They're regurgitated. We've heard them before and, they've been overcome before. So before we move on to the Q&A, I think that a big reason that we wanted to have this session and invite you to be a part of NYU Trans Awareness Week and to invite all of our attendees to join us today was to think about, how we can show up both within trans and non-binary communities and outside. So for allies and the broader public who support trans and non-binary communities, those who have trans and non-binary friends, family members, partners, how can they show up to face these challenges and contribute to the fight against all of this anti-trans legislation and this growing movement that we're seeing across the globe?
Yeah, so I first like to just sort of ground this in that this is a fight that implicates all of us. And so at the end of the day, if we have a government that is empowered to infringe upon our bodily autonomy, that a government is allowed to fundamentally define, which it always has been, of course, and I think we could have a sort of broader critique of our entire US legal framework, and we should, but as we're moving into further expansions of that apparatus of control, that is something that implicates everyone. It's not like we're going to stop with trans people. And so I do think when we have these conversations, it's important to situate this as a fight for everyone, one that is interconnected. And even if we think about the state legislative fights, for example, the reason why we've been seeing so many state legislative attacks be able to flourish is because the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which allowed for states to continue and expand their voter suppression efforts, which then allowed these states to become gerrymandered in the way that they are. And you have supermajority legislatures that are able to then, ban abortion, ban trans healthcare, ban teaching of Black history, ban mention of gay people. Like, this is all connected, of course. And so when we think about what the fight ahead is, it's a fight that implicates all of us, and not just in this sort of formalistic framework of our rights, but in our material survival. So getting people to be engaged feels really important as a threshold step, because we are under-engaged, and the stakes, are often appreciated once it's too late. I think a lot of people were like, oh, Roe v. Wade won't be overturned. Well, it was very obvious that it was going to be overturned, and we had the potential ability to stop that, but that window passed long before people started to become more aware of the crisis facing access to safe and legal abortions in the US. So that's, sort of point one. And then I think about this on sort of the micro level, and then the sort of political engagement, and then the resource allocation level. The micro level is, in our lives, we all have the immediate urgency and need to shift the public discourse. And that means challenging people's expectations about norms of gender, challenging people's assumptions that everyone fits into binaries, challenging people's ideas about our healthcare. And so this is something that plays out in all of our conversations, in our families, in our communities, in our schools, in all the institutions in which we interface. So we all have a role to play in destabilizing those power dynamics and assumptions. So that's sort of the thing we can all always be doing, and it shouldn't just be left to trans people to do it. And then there's the political engagement piece. I think that, have to think about, obviously, the way in which we engage at the federal level, but also so much of the way in which our bodies are controlled is happening at the state and local level. And, you know, if you live in New York City, there's lots of things to be done. But also, if you live in New York City or if you live in California, it doesn't mean you have no stake in the fight in Texas or Alabama or Idaho, because the way in which our system works is that they're putting out laws that are then challenged in court that then have implications for all of us, not to mention the setting of legal norms that then spread throughout the country. So we need to be more engaged in our own state and local elections, but also in state and local elections and lawmaking that are happening in other states. And so getting connected to local organizations in those states, figuring out how you can help support, not by phone banking, not by calling a legislator in Tennessee if you don't live there, but in phone banking to help ensure that people are calling their representatives. So there's lots of things that we can do at that level. And then in terms of resource redistribution, I think if we have money, give it to trans-led organizations. If you have other resources, if you have a skill, if you're a graphic designer, work with, offer some skills to local organizations. Say, look, I know you're having an action. Do you want me to do your graphics? Do you want me to make a reel for you? There's all sorts of ways that redistribution can happen. You don't have to just have financial wealth. You just have to have something to share. And this is our collective responsibility to take care of each other. If you live in New York, host someone who needs to come here to access gender affirming care or an abortion. These are all the ways that we can disrupt these systems and change the material conditions of people's lives.
Thank you. So we'll move into Q&A now. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to all of the questions, but we'll try our best to answer as many of these questions as we can get to with the remaining time that we have for this session. So first, this is not a question, but a few attendees shared just a deep appreciation, Chase, for you and your work and for this conversation that we're having today. So I wanted to first share a few of those comments. Someone said, I just want to express gratitude for this conversation. Someone else said, thank you so much for everything that you do, Mr. Strangio. It is such a privilege to hear you speak. It's difficult to find trans masc role models, and we are so proud for you to represent trans masc and trans people everywhere. So those are just a few of the comments that were left, and we have some questions as well. So the first question from the Q&A is, what are some sources, going back to your comment on the New York Times and their coverage on trans folks, which has not been great. What are some sources for news that you recommend that does a good job of combating all of the misinformation and disinformation on the legislation that's impacting trans and non-binary communities?
Yeah, well, so I mean, first I would say that one of the really serious problems is the utter collapse of local journalism. And so when we think about how state houses used to be covered, you would have local, local left media and just local papers that knew how to cover their state legislatures. And now we just don't have that because of the ways in which media conglomerates have just, in essence, crushed local reporting as a general matter. So that is just a systemic reality that is contributing to all of these problems in terms of access to information, how news is covered, and how it's disseminated. I would say, where I go is sort of first and foremost to get information about what's needed in states. I go first to grassroots organizations in those states. So I think that unfortunately, it's difficult because we don't have great national reporting, but I also don't think the answer is to go to people's Substacks and Twitter accounts either, because the reality is that people just don't have the strategy information on the ground. And so I think it's important to go to local organizations, see what they're asking for, see what they want from people outside the state, because it can undermine local strategies to have people from outside the state do particular things. And so being mindful of that. When it comes to sort of national reporting, I tend to follow more the Intercept and the New Republic and Democracy Now! I think has, they're just better at bringing in people who are covering the trends in a way that's not situating a debate over trans life. And I would say, as to the legacy publications, Washington Post is just way better than the New York Times.
Thank you. Next question that we have from the Q&A. Do you think that the current presidential administration has been a good enough ally for trans and non-binary communities? If so, in what ways have you seen positive movement in this presidency, and what areas for growth and trans and non-binary communities have been seen?
Well, so if I think about sort of explicit LGBTQ policies, I would say overall this administration is pretty good on balance if you're talking about how they're interpreting federal law and what they're doing to enforce explicit LGBTQ protections. I also think, unfortunately, we've been in a situation where Congress has failed to act just across the board as lawmakers for so many years that what we end up having is an executive that is expansive in its efforts to in essence, and do executive orders and other things within the executive branch. And this goes across parties. This has happened over the last 20 years. And then what happens is you have every single thing that the executive does challenged by the other party in court and then enjoined. So if you think about Biden's student loan, his very minimal and inadequate student loan forgiveness program, it was immediately enjoined, as were many of his climate policies. And so we're in a very stagnant reality where you have Congress doing nothing, the party in power trying to use the executive to do something, and then the party not in power going to court to stop it. And this is just an utter failure of our so-called democratic system. So I would say my main criticisms of the Biden administration concern things like, inadequate response in forgiving student loans, horrible immigration policies, horrible international global policies, and those obviously have an impact on LGBTQ people. And so I think there's a real reason to be hesitant. I think in another world, I just don't understand how we could have this be the candidate that's running against Donald Trump most likely. That said, I don't engage in sort of political analysis. I don't really participate in the electoral machine. I mean, I participate, I do vote, but I don't sort of think about my role as being electoral in nature. And so at the end of the day, I will say that, I see the grave, catastrophic harms of both a Democratic president and a Republican president. But I see sort of life-altering, catastrophic harms that are impossible to see our way through under another Donald Trump administration. And that's true for trans people, that's true for immigrants, that's true for our sort of global diplomacy. There's unlimited number of concerns I have with that prospect. And so at the end of the day, we're going to sue whoever is in power. That's what we do. We'll sue the government. We'll sue a Democrat. We'll sue a Republican. We're always trying to push to make things better. But you can't, if there is no court system, if there is, if there's an utter collapse of these systems as inadequate as they are, I think that has real material consequences in the short term. And I don't know what we do in a 2025 where you have a Donald Trump president and a Republican controlled Congress. I think that it will be a terrifying time.
Yeah. This next question, it says, the baseline for trans rights prior to the wave of anti-trans legislation was already not optimal, and it can sometimes feel disheartening to always be in a defensive position. If you were in an offensive position, if you could wave a magic wand or had a more sympathetic Supreme Court, what would be your utopian vision for trans people in America and for a version of pro-trans legislation?
Yeah, I think it's always complicated because I think my version of more trans utopia is the government stays away from us. So I'm not someone who's like, let's go pass all of this legislation that tells the government how to manage us. I want a world where we already have access to healthcare, that we have single payer models of healthcare, that we invest in initiatives to end homelessness, that we have more worker protections, and sort of taking away the widespread material harms of our capitalist system and our legal system, which enables it. And so that's the utopia. And then within that, it is through the government's distance from us that we're allowed to build the magical, expansive trans worlds that I think we would all benefit from. So I see the trans utopia as one in which we're saying, stop interfering with our vision of the world. We will take care of each other. We will build beautiful things. We will make beautiful art. We will, sort of expand our understandings of what our bodies can do, how they function, how we build families and kinship structures. And that's the world I want. And it's one in which, at least a government that I can fathom I don't want near us. I don't want to go say pass more equality laws, because equality laws are very insufficient and do very little in the long term. You have in New York City all sorts of laws that protect people, and you have widespread policing and incarceration, homelessness, horrible education systems. We have to invest in our public goods, and then the role of the government in the trans futures that I want is one of staying away from us.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll do two more questions. We're nearing the end of our time. Chase has been delivering a sermon today, so thank you. So this next question from the chat, can you talk about a case and or client that you've worked with that has greatly shaped your personal and professional work?
Oh, that's such a good question and so hard. I think that early on in my legal career, I think I was still in law school, and I was interning at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is where I ended up working after law school, and then graduated and had my first job at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. And so much of the work that I did there was representing trans and non-binary people in New York State, largely in the city jails and the state prisons, and doing work to push back the most severe harms of our government on our communities. And those are obviously in institutional and carceral settings. And in the process, I met Lorena Borjas, who was a Latina trans woman in Jackson Heights, Queens, where I also lived. And she was just relentless in her advocacy for her community. And this was at a time during the Obama administration in which he was ramping up deportations and the cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. And so undocumented trans women who were over policed and profiled as sex workers, particularly on Roosevelt Avenue in Jackson Heights, were being rounded up by police and then faced, very immediate and devastating immigration consequences. And so I remember there were two young women who were in a fight defending themselves on Roosevelt Avenue in Jackson Heights. And that's when I really met Lorena. She was, insistent, came to my office every single day that we show up and make sure that they never, that they had no immigration consequences, that they were not put into removal proceedings, and that we got them out of jail. We could not get them out of jail during the pendency of their criminal case, which ultimately lasted for 2 years. But during the course of the partnership with Lorena, I ended up working and doing a lot of bail work and sort of started with Lorena a cash bail fund. And this was before we sort of had the larger institutional bail funds. We had a smaller fund that we developed together. And she taught me both that, my legal work was very limited in terms of its material impact on people's lives. I didn't speak Spanish, and she was exceedingly frustrated with me in that regard. And she felt like I wasn't, and we weren't at SRLP doing enough for the trans Latina immigrants in New York City, in Queens in particular, but also in the Bronx. So she pushed me in every way, and we started the bail fund, and she also just showed me, and this is where I sort of feel that resilience of our communities, she took care of everyone. She herself had struggled and suffered in so many ways, had been failed by every system that we have. But she had every single person I knew in Jackson Heights had a cell phone that somehow Lorena was paying for, that she was providing Metro cards to people all the time, making sure that people's immigration cases were taken, and just, would also bring people together in sort of acts of love and caretaking. And every Friday night, there would be parties that she would have in which people would also get legal trainings and also get HIV testing and also get connected to other services. But it was through that communal refusal to be forgotten, but also to lose the refusal to give up on the fun and the care and the energy that felt so queer and essential to how we build in times of despair. And so working with Lorena transformed my life, changed my life, and personally changed my life. I mean, I remember when my partner at the time and I were expecting our child in 2012. Lorena threw us a baby shower and everyone came and they bought us a stroller. I was like, how did you afford a stroller? And so just, you know, she was an integral part of my life. And then she died of COVID early in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, when so many people in Jackson Heights were dying. And so just a reminder of all of these systemic failures. And she died because she has such negative experiences as a trans woman of color, as an immigrant in our medical system, that she waited to go get care. And that's why so many people were dying. And we knew that that was what was happening. And so I will always fight in her honor and also celebrate in her honor and take care of trans people in her honor, because that's all of what I learned from her.
Thank you for sharing that. And that was a really wonderful question. So thank you to the person who asked that question. One final question to wrap up. You know, this has been a heavy session, but it's a heavy climate that we find ourselves in right now in so many different ways. And, you know, Chase, you're really on the front lines and you have been for so many years now. And so if you can maybe leave us with what is bringing you joy, inspiration, and motivation, either in your life or in your work or both. What refills, you know, your cup as you're doing this really challenging but crucial work all the time?
Well, I couldn't do the work all the time if I wasn't doing it with so many people that I love and respect and have fun with. And so as much as it is grueling, as much as it is draining, it is something that itself fortifies me. I like having a tool to fight back. And so that is how I've been able to do it for as long as I have, and why I can imagine doing it for much, much longer. And I think that I'm good at sort of ensuring that I'm having fun both in and out of work, that there's moments on the weekends, and that I'm never disconnected from community, which is what enriches me. And I love my clients, and I love living in New York, and I'll never forget all of the people and things that give me joy every day. And fighting to preserve that and fighting for more people to have that is always going to feel worth it.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow. So that brings us to the end of our session today. Chase, I just want to thank you so much for being here, for sharing your brilliance, your expertise. It really was an absolute honor to be in conversation with you today. And I think that, you know, I'm leaving this with so much knowledge, and I hope that our attendees feel the same way. I also want to thank NYU Outlaw for partnering with us on the event. And while NYU Trans Awareness Week is wrapping up, we have one more event for folks who are part of the NYU community. We have a trans and non-binary social, which will take place tomorrow, Thursday, November 16th, from 5:30 to 7. That'll be in Kimmel 802. And you can find the information to register for that in the NYU events page. So Chase, again, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.